Hello and welcome to this video tutorial on how to go about planning the extract question for A-level history. This unit is the Tudors 1C, but the skills are basically the same for any paper 1. And this question is about the economy under Henry VIII. So you can see the question there and one of the extracts there. Obviously in the exam there would be two more that you would have to also evaluate. But for this video we're just going to evaluate one of them. So you can read the extract, you can pause the video to read it, and what I'm going to do is work my way through how I would annotate this if I were in the exam. So remember, you have roughly 15 to 20 minutes of planning time in the exam, and then the rest of the hour, so the 45 minutes left, you have to write your 3 paragraphs about each extract in turn. So really it should only take you about 10 to 15 minutes to actually write the extract paragraph. The key to that is obviously very good planning, because you also can't reuse evidence. So you need to make sure you know exactly what pieces of evidence you're going to use for each extract so that you're not reusing facts and making it seem to the examiner as if you only have a very limited knowledge base, which I'm sure is not true. So let's get started. First thing that you need to do is you need to identify at least 2 arguments that are being made in this extract. So you need to kind of try and identify a main argument. So this is going to be fairly general. It's going to be maybe the underlying kind of main message of the extract. So if we read it through, I have come to the conclusion that I think the main argument in relation to the state of the English economy under Henry VIII, that's the key words there, because you need to make sure that you're always relating whatever you say the main argument is to those words. So actually, when you're identifying your main argument, I would advise that you write it as this: main, the state of the English economy under Henry VIII was ... Then you're not going to lose focus on the wording of the question, because not everything in the extract is relevant to what you actually are going to be talking about in this answer. So it's not asking you to just go line by line and say what the historian says and then give some facts to counter it or support it. You've got to come up with the overall interpretation through the extract. So I've read this and I've decided that I think the main argument that John Guy is making is that the state of the English economy under Henry VIII was strong and flourishing. And I want to develop it a little bit further, because that's how you get level 4, level 5. And so I've picked out the cause that John Guy says this is due to. And he basically says it's due to this, the high population pressures. He argues that this is actually an economic stimulus for Tudor England under Henry VIII. So I know that I've underlined that there. So that's probably going to be one of my quotes that I use in order to support what Guy said and where I've got this argument from. But remember, I want to get 2 quotes, because otherwise the examiner might think that you've just read the first sentence and you've been, oh, okay, it's the population. You need to show them you've read carefully through the whole extract. So I would also blend this with the final sentence as well. So when I'm showing what Guy has said, I would say, I know this, or well, I wouldn't say I, because we don't use the first person. I'd say Guy argues this where he states, some were therefore able to benefit from ... high population pressures, and quote marks, England was economically healthier, more expansive and more optimistic under the Tudors than at any time since the Romans, quote marks. So I've got my 2 quotes there. So I'm going to put 1 and 1 so I remember they relate to the main argument, because now the next thing we have to do is pick out the subsidiary argument, or another argument that John Guy is making that maybe isn't the main one that's popping out, but you do have to identify 2 because that's the kind of on the mark scheme, it does say arguments, not argument. And again, in the question, you'll see it says arguments, plural. So you really need to make sure you're picking out 2 or 3 arguments if you have time. But I think 3 is quite ambitious. So after reading this, I have gone for the subsidiary argument being coming more from this bit of the extract here. And I've said, again, the state of the English economy, I'm just going to put E economy under H eighth, was, and I'm going to say that I think John Guy is saying it was moving towards a capitalist, oh sorry, that's gone off the page, capitalist and individualistic system. And again, I'm going to then be like, oh, where's my quotes coming from? How do I know that that's what John Guy's arguing? And again, you've got to find them in two different places in the extract, because otherwise it does just look like you've read a bit of it and then randomly panicked and said that that's the argument. So you're paraphrasing. And on the mark scheme, you really can only get into level 2 or 3 if you're paraphrasing. You can't go past that, and it's really strict. So you need to make sure you're showing that you've read the whole thing. That's why it's so important to have 2 or more quotes for each of your arguments. So I'm going to say, well, obviously it does use the word capitalistic, so that is going to have to come into my quotes. So I'll probably go from increasing demand that created a more capitalistic form of farming. But then, because it's talking about this individualistic system, I would then pick up Guy's point about the fact that he believes the state was kind of helpless in a way, because it was moving towards this kind of free market economy where the state didn't have much control. So I would use those 2 quotes here, increasing demand, and I'd mark them like this so I don't get confused when I write my answer, 2 and 2. Okay, so I've got my arguments, I've got my quotes. This is good. Those are the 2 most important things to do, because if you don't get that bit right, you might as well not write the rest of the answer, to be honest with you, because you only are awarded marks for knowledge if they're in relation to the arguments. So if you haven't identified the arguments correctly or thoroughly, or you've just paraphrased and changed it into your own words, line by line, you can't get any credit for knowledge. So you need to make sure that you spend a lot of time on this section. The knowledge section is something where you then have to basically work out, I'd say, 2 facts that support the main, 2 facts that challenge the main argument, and then again 2 for the subsidiary, 2 for the subsidiary that challenge the argument. So in an exam situation, you're a bit limited in terms of the pens that you're allowed. So I'm actually going to change to a pencil now, so that I know this is my evidence. So this is where your revision comes in handy, because obviously you need to have a bank of knowledge in your brain so that you can just whip these facts out of thin air and apply them to the extract to show that John Guy is or is not convincing. So firstly, let's support the main argument. So if we're supporting the main argument, support, I'm going to say fact 1, we've got to relate it to the high population pressures, because that's what I've said in my argument. So fact 1, I'm going to say woolen cloth exports doubled during the reign of Henry VIII, which they did, but I need to link it to this population pressure. And clearly the reason was when the population grew, this meant there were more domestic workers who could work in the putting out industry, which is where, or the cottage industry, where people worked from their homes, particularly in areas like East Anglia. So I've shown, okay, John Guy has a point. The population growth has created more workers who are then able to stimulate the woolen cloth export market, because there's literally more products being produced. Then, second part, for my support, I would say, okay, another thing that supports John Guy is probably the fact that population pressure drove up prices, which we'll come to later as obviously being a bad thing for some people, but it was good for landowners and farmers. And then I might give the fact that food prices, again, doubled over the course of the reign. So I've got some statistics with my doubling of food prices. I've got some then explanation as to how the population growth led to this. So population pressure obviously stimulates demand, which means that businesses and markets can charge more for the food because people are willing to pay the money. Population growth in terms of the wool and cloth industry obviously provides more workers. So I think I've supported John Guy there, lucky him. But now what you need to do is you need to challenge it as well, because it says evaluate, doesn't it? Or assess how convincing. You can't fully assess something properly if you haven't looked at the two different sides of the extract, as in, is it convincing or is it not convincing? You can't just write a one-sided answer about whether, how great John Guy is and how you agree with everything he says, even though he is a great historian. So we've got to challenge John Guy, and that's what we're going to plan now. So let's go challenge. Well, I'm going to make the point that actually population pressure was harmful in a large number of cases. So actually his point about the fact that, high population pressure led to a strong and flourishing economy actually isn't true in some cases. So it was harmful. For example, inflation was at 400% by the end of the reign, which essentially meant that there was high levels of starvation because people couldn't afford basic necessities. You can see this as well in the fact that people started migrating in massive numbers to towns in the period because they thought they would find a better way of life there. Obviously, this then made the problem worse because that meant there were not as many workers in rural areas, and so who was making the food? Less food to go around, more people, big problem with subsistence or actually, just having enough food to eat. In terms of the food production issues, you can also back those up because there were some really, really bad harvests, for example, notably in 1520 and 1527. So I think we've shown there that population pressure did have harmful effects on food production and also on people starving to death, which is clearly not the sign of a healthy, flourishing economy if some of your people are literally starving. And then we need a second challenge point. So I'm just going to go over here because I'm kind of running out of room. So my second challenge point would be, I would probably challenge John Guy's assertion that high population pressure was the cause of this flourishing economy, because even if you are looking at the wealthy who did clearly benefit, there are other reasons that they may have benefited, so you might want to think about some of those. So I would say things like the release of land into the economy was actually stimulated by the dissolution of the monasteries. Because obviously there was then all the church land available, which never been available. So John Guy might be over-exaggerating the role that the population growth played at the expense of things which were actually state decisions, like the dissolution of the monasteries. You could also argue there was actually a boom, so a period of economic growth, at the end of the reign, 1544 to 1547. That was due to debasement, which we know was actually very harmful in the long run. But at the end of Henry's reign, it actually looked positive. So that might explain where some of John Guy's interpretation has come from, this kind of artificial boom in the last 3 years of the reign. So there are definitely different reasons, such as the dissolution of the monasteries and debasement, for this strong and flourishing economy that John Guy claims exists. And they're not just what he argues, which is the high population pressure. So I've planned now my support and my challenge for the main argument, and that's right, I've got to do it again with the subsidiary argument, you'll be delighted to know. I'll just say now, obviously this does take a while in terms of planning. I've been doing this now for 13 minutes and 43 seconds, and evidently in the exam, that's near the total of the time that you would have to plan for all of the extracts that you were going to do, not just the first one. Now, obviously, I've been a bit slowed down because I've been explaining it out loud, but also I would just say the only way to get faster at this is to practice. You can cut down the number of points you're making in support and challenge if by the end of year 13 you're still having timing problems. But realistically, the only way to get faster is just to get used to this system, so you don't have to go through the motions of thinking, what do I need to do next? Oh dear, should I do the main or subsidiary? What's that word again? Support, challenge, what is it? You need to just get used to it so it's almost, automatic. And of course, you need to make sure your revision is really good so you don't spend ages kind of rooting around in your brain trying to find facts that you need to back up or challenge the extract. So those are my tips really. I know it's boring and there's no quick fix. You just need to practice, but it will reap massive rewards for you in the long run, and it will make you a better reader in general. It's not just about passing an exam, it's about being able to read and absorb a text quickly and get the main argument of it, because that is such a vital skill in life, not just in history A level. Anyway, back to the subsidiary argument. So just a reminder, the subsidiary was that the state of the English economy under Henry VIII was moving towards a capitalist and individualistic system. And my quotes that I highlighted were about the increasing demand, and also the state could do very little to combat any peasant distress. So in support of this, you've got to mention enclosure. It's one of the biggest signs of kind of this individualistic move away from the commons to the individual, because they literally take away common land and make it individual land. So it can't be much more obvious than that in terms of this growth of an individualistic society. So growth of enclosure, but we can't just write, oh, growth of enclosure. We have to prove that there was growth of enclosure. And I think we use the Enclosure Acts to do that, because it proves it was such a big problem that it was coming up in Parliament time and time again. And there are a string of Enclosure Acts, really. There's 1515. 1526 is actually a bill, not an act, because it's not passed, but it shows there was concern. 1534 as well. So there are repeated Enclosure Acts showing that enclosure is still being practiced, and you could even say that it wasn't exterminated by the end of the reign, because in 1548 Edward VI and Somerset also passed one. So clearly it was an ongoing problem throughout the reign. So we've got enclosure. I think also for support, you could say that there are examples in this period of entrepreneurs, so individuals who are really making the most of the situation, and they're benefiting from this kind of free market capitalism. So we could give the example of William Stump, who was an MP, and he essentially rose from nothing to become an MP and a very wealthy landowner, because he based it off the wool trade, and based it actually off enclosing a huge amount of land. So that kind of all links into one point, but it is two pieces of evidence. So we've got 1 and we've got 2 for supporting John Guy there, saying, yeah, okay, we can see traits of capitalism, we can see traits of individualism coming into the economic system during the Tudor period. I think then we challenge him, and I think this is fairly straightforward in terms of challenge. Because he has really downplayed the role of the state, which I find astonishing when you have 2 social reformers in government for most of the period who definitely tried to enforce relief for peasant distress. So when he says they could do very little, I think he's over-exaggerating that. It makes it sound like the state was just helpless amidst the forces of capitalism, but actually it was choices made by individuals, not the growth of this monstrous capitalism. It was actually people proposing action or people taking action, and then Parliament or rich nobility avoiding taking that action. So we need some examples. So let's, for example, talk about the fact that enclosure actually was successfully challenged by Wolsey, especially in 1517. Oh dear, I've written 1517 instead of Wolsey. In 1517. So he brought 188 landowners to trial for enclosing land illegally. So that does show the state could do something. The state could hold wealthy landowners accountable, probably for one of the first times ever, for this offence of enclosing, and it could try and combat this capitalist individualism in that way. I think we also talk in this section about the work of Thomas Cromwell. So this is a slightly different angle on it, but we talk about the Vagrancy Act, which was in 1534. Now, I know some of it was really not very progressive in terms of the way they treated the undeserving poor, but we can focus here on the deserving poor. Cromwell was essentially proposing a system of welfare and aid, which would be publicly funded from taxpayers in the form of church taxes, and then redistributed to the deserving poor in order to help those people who had been badly affected by the forces of capitalism. So people who had been made homeless because of enclosure, they'd been forced off their land, or people who couldn't work because their land had been enclosed and so they were unable to farm it. and things like that. So I'm not fully convinced by John Guy saying, oh, the state could do very little. Actually, we can see there are ways that the state can act and did act. And maybe the reason that the state did very little might relate to something else Thomas Cromwell proposed, which was a public works programme. So he could see there was an unemployment problem, there was a poverty problem. So he proposed a public works programme in the 1530s. But that was rejected by Parliament, possibly because, it was a little bit too utopian, it was a little bit too progressive, and it was kind of felt that, that's not the role of the state. So I don't think it's what John Guy's saying, where the state could do very little, as if it's helpless. It was a choice. They chose to do very little. And so I think the way that he's sort of overemphasized the power of this capitalist progress is over-exaggerated. So we've got all of our evidence, and then we just need to plan our mini conclusion, because it's really important not to forget that. It can really make the difference in your grade between one level and the next. So level 4 to level 5, level 3 to level 4 sometimes as well, if you get this mini conclusion right. So you just need to sort of work out generally, okay, how do we feel about John Guy's interpretation? So I'm just going to do this down here. So for my mini conclusion, oh dear, I'm writing on sellotape. For my mini conclusion, I've looked at everything, and I'm going to say something like, John Guy has called on evidence regarding the experiences of the wealthy and middle classes to present a picture, just going to say picture, of a strong economy. But his apparent near silence on the peasantry and the actions of the state means that he has underemphasized the negative aspects of the state of the economy. And again, we link it back there to the words of the question, because that is how we know we're always focused. So we end with the words of the question, the state of the economy. I see it's gone off my page there, but it says the state of the economy. I'm not going to try and move this. So essentially, that is how you go about planning an extract. I have also attached to this a model answer, how that paragraph would then appear in your writing, but you've pretty much written it there. All you need to do is make sure you're weaving together. Every time you give a fact that says support or challenge, you need to use the word convincing or unconvincing after you use it. So for example, if you were challenging the main argument because you were talking about the fact that population pressure was harmful, you would say, John Guy appears unconvincing when he discusses the benefits of population pressure. As you can see in the example, that there was 400% inflation as a result. This makes John Guy's argument unconvincing. If you feel like you're saying unconvincing too many times, you're saying it enough times. You really need to make sure you are repeating whether the evidence makes the extract convincing or unconvincing all the time. Because if you just go off writing all your knowledge down and then loosely link it to the extract right at the end in the mini conclusion down here, that is not a sustained focus on the question. The question is about the extract, the question is about your knowledge together. So you have to make sure you're always linking them together. Otherwise, unfortunately, you do end up in level 2. And I've seen some really good answers which have been in level 2, even though the person clearly knows almost everything there is to know about the A-level tutor course, because they just haven't focused on the extract enough. So please do look at the model answer that this created as well. I hope this was really useful. And my class, if you have any questions, please do ask me. I will be happy to answer them.